John Carter was 82 years old. No medals on his chest, no ceremony around his name. Just an old Marine Corps sergeant major walking with a cane and a faded military ID, one that had survived more war zones than the men who now questioned its validity. It was Veterans Day morning at Fort Grantham. The gates were open to the public, the speeches polished, the flags crisp in the breeze. But when John approached the security checkpoint, the guards barely looked up. A younger officer squinted at the ID, chuckled, and passed it to his superior. "This can't be real," one of them smirked. "He's probably just here for the free coffee." What they didn't know was that the man they were mocking had led covert missions so classified even the files were redacted into silence. The ID may have looked worn, but it was very real, and so was the name behind it. Within the hour, a call came from the Pentagon. Not a complaint, a warning, because someone in Washington still remembered who John Carter was and what he'd done, and Fort Grantham, once proud and orderly, was about to learn the cost of forgetting its own legends. That day, a base bowed its head, not because it was told to, but because it realized too late honor doesn't fade. It only waits to be recognized. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and tell us, have you ever met someone like John Carter? Someone who walks quietly, but whose presence changes everything. If this story speaks to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because some names deserve more than a salute. They deserve to be remembered. The gate of Fort Grantham gleamed under the Veterans Day sun, but no one noticed the old man approaching. John Carter, 82, with a brown wool jacket pressed to near perfection, walked straight toward the checkpoint. His steps were deliberate, measured a rhythm long forgotten by the young soldiers who now manned this post. To them, he was just another relic. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper, 28, spotted him first. Leaning lazily against the booth, Ryan adjusted his sunglasses, the smirk already forming before the old man spoke. "Good morning. I'm here for the memorial," Carter said, extending an ID card. Its edges were worn soft by decades. In a wallet, its color faded but still intact. Ryan took the card with 2 fingers, exaggerating his distaste, as though handling a piece of old chewing gum. He squinted at it, shaking his head with mock pity. "This expired in 1990. The words were sharp, aimed to wound. "Sir, if you're even still a sir, this is an active military base, not a thrift store for old war stories." The air tightened. A few younger guards chuckled, then a few more. Emboldened, Ryan twirled the ID between his fingers like a toy. "Listen, Pops. We respect veterans, but respect doesn't bend the rules. Valid ID only. Maybe try the museum down the road. They like history there." His grin widened as he flicked the card forward. The plastic spun in the air, landing face down on the concrete with a muted slap. "Oops. Guess time's not the only thing that's passed you by." That one hit. Laughter rippled through the booth. It was cheap easy, the kind that feeds on itself. Ryan basked in it, but John Carter didn't move. Not right away. When he finally bent down, it wasn't a slump of defeat. His back was straight. His fingers closed around the ID with the same care as he once did field reports under fire. His movement was calm, precise. He didn't rush to prove anything. And that's what made it worse for them. The laughter faltered. For a brief, uncomfortable moment, every man watching felt smaller. Ryan wasn't finished. "Bullies never are. You can't just stroll onto a base waving a souvenir. This isn't bingo night, old man." More snickers followed, but they were thinner now, uncertain. Carter simply nodded, once tucked the ID back into his jacket, and turned. No words. No reaction. His cane clicked softly against the concrete as he walked back toward the parking lot, leaving behind only the echo of what they had done. Inside the booth, Private Alex Torres stood silently, arms crossed, jaw clenched. He hadn't laughed. He hadn't found it funny. His grandfather used to walk like that. Same deliberate pace. Same silence. Alex had seen that look before, the kind that doesn't ask for recognition because it's earned far beyond the need for it. His gut twisted as he watched Carter retreat. Something wasn't right. "That didn't sit right," Torres muttered almost to himself. Ryan caught it. "What's that, Torres? You getting sentimental on me? The guy's idea is older than you. Hell, older than my mom. You think we should salute every grandpa with a story?" He laughed again, but the sharpness had dulled. Torres didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on Carter, now seated on a bench beneath a quiet tree. The old man removed his hat, placed it on his lap, and stared ahead. No defeat, no drama. Just waiting. The sunlight caught something on Carter's cane. Torres squinted. There, faint but unmistakable, was the emblem of the United States Marine Corps. Etched, not printed. Real. Authentic. Torres's fingers itched toward his phone. His cousin worked logistics in Arlington. A quick search wouldn't hurt. Quietly, discreetly. Just a name. Just to know. Meanwhile, behind him the jokes kept rolling. Someone mimicked Carter's slow walk, dragging their feet and leaning on an imaginary cane. The booth erupted in fresh laughter, but it felt thinner now, like air leaking from a balloon. Outside, John Carter remained still, untouched by their noise. But Torres felt it. A tension. A coil tightening beneath the surface. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And while the rest laughed, Torres couldn't shake the feeling that they had just humiliated a man who carried more weight than any of them could imagine. Private Brandon Lewis thought it would be funny. A 10-second video. Just enough to get a few laughs. He angled his phone from inside the booth, zooming in on the old man sitting under the tree. John Carter hadn't moved since they'd shooed him off. Hat on his lap. Eyes ahead. The perfect target for a cheap joke. Brandon hit record. Operation Grandpa Sneak into a military base 101. He muttered, adding the caption before hitting send. The clip pinged straight to the barracks group chat. Within minutes, phones vibrated across Fort Grantham. Torres heard it immediately. The shift. A chorus of snorts and chuckles rippled through the base's private feed. Comments poured in faster than he could track. Some were harmless, most weren't. Check out Sergeant Bingo. Needs a walker, not a salute. Somebody get this relic back to the museum. Torres didn't laugh. This wasn't a gut feeling anymore. This was a problem in motion. He pulled out his phone. His cousin Emily worked logistics out of Arlington. Not front line, but she knew how to run a personnel check quietly. Torres didn't hesitate. Need a fast lookup. Name's John Carter, USMC, high probability Vietnam era. Quiet, please. While he waited, the booth stayed loud. But this wasn't like earlier. The jokes felt forced now. Some of the guards scrolled through comments with unease creeping into their grins. One comment stuck out. Simple. Unadorned. That better not be John Carter of Falcon Wing. Torres blinked. Falcon Wing wasn't casual history. It was whispered in briefing rooms. A Black Ops rescue in North Vietnam, officially denied. Quietly revered. Only a few names ever surfaced. Carter was one of them. Brandon's smirk was faltering. Relax. Could be any Carter. How many vets got that name? But the damage was accelerating. Posts were being shared beyond the barracks chat. Mentions of Carter's record surfaced. References to clearance levels. People were asking real questions now. Not jokes. Facts. Torres's phone buzzed. Emily. You don't screw around, huh, John Carter? Sergeant Major, Marine Corps, Operation Falcon Wing Lead, Clearance 117B. His ID might look ancient, but it's valid. Indefinitely. A knot twisted in Torres's gut. The same ID Ryan Cooper had tossed to the ground like trash was more legitimate than half the brass who strutted this base. He looked through the booth window. Carter hadn't flinched. Still seated. Still composed. That kind of patience wasn't passive. It was the patience of a man who knew storms came and went, but principles stayed put. The tone in the booth shifted. Hey guys. One of the corporals was scrolling faster now. I think we really messed up. Ryan scoffed. Come on. Bureaucrats love red tape. Some old ops file doesn't mean we owe him a parade. But no one was laughing anymore. The post was spreading. Fast. Officers' names were popping up in the chat. A few had already requested the original footage. And when officers got involved, it meant accountability was coming. Torres exhaled slowly. They hadn't just embarrassed a veteran. They had disgraced the uniform in front of the wrong audience. Brandon paled. We should take it down. Too late. The internet didn't care about regret. One stupid joke. That was all it took. The comments turned razor sharp. Not against Carter, but against the guards at Gate 4. Names were being named. Photos were being screenshotted. Faces matched to ranks. In the distance, Carter remained still. Torres's phone vibrated once more. "Emily, word of advice, someone high-up's about to make a call. This is going to explode. Brace yourself." Outside, the flag over Fort Grantham rippled gently. Inside, no one was speaking. The laughter had collapsed into a suffocating silence. The consequences were no longer theoretical. This was happening. The story of John Carter had begun to spread through Fort Grantham. The kitchen of Fort Grantham's mess hall was alive with its usual chaos. Steam hissed from industrial stoves, trays clattered, and the sharp scent of grease floated through the air. But at the center of it all, Deborah Lane moved like she owned the place. Because she did. 60-years-old head cook for the past 25. She had seen recruits come and go, officers rise and fall. Nothing rattled her. Until today. 2 privates barged in, laughing loud, half-joking, half-gossiping. "You should have seen it, Deb. Some old guy tried to walk in with a museum-grade ID. Looked like he wandered off from the VFW. Ryan tore him a new one." Deborah didn't flinch. She kept stirring a massive pot of grits, letting the rhythm of the spoon ground her. She'd heard every flavor of barracks banter. Usually it wasn't worth a breath. Had this hat one of the privates continued grinning. Soft felt not even military issue. Looked like a prop. Walked up like he still belonged. That made her pause. Hat. Soft felt. Not a cap. Not standard issue. Didn't say much either, the second private added. Cooper told him to try the museum. Old guy didn't even argue. Just turned around and sat under that tree like a lawn ornament. Deborah's grip on the spoon tightened. Slowly, deliberately, she set it down. Wiped her hands on her apron. The voices around her faded into a dull hum. What did he look like? She asked, her tone flat but sharp enough to cut through the kitchen noise. The 2 privates blinked. Old. Black. Maybe 80-something. Brown hat. Wore it like it meant something. Deborah's chest constricted. The image was vivid now, pulled from the recesses of her memory. Not today's mess hall, not the clean lines of Fort Grantham as it stood now, but the smoking wreckage of the fuel depot in 1982. That day wasn't in the tour guides. That day the depot exploded in a roar that rattled windows 5 miles out. Flames leapt stories high. People ran because that's what people do when the world catches fire. But not him. She remembered the way he walked into the smoke. Not sprinting, not panicking, just moving forward, purposeful, controlled. She saw him pull 3 men out of that inferno, dragging them like they weighed nothing. No gear, no backup, just him. And when the chaos settled, he disappeared as quietly as he had come. No medals, no ceremony, just a man with a brown hat and a silence that said more than citations ever could. "I think," Deborah said slowly. "I've seen him before." The kitchen stilled. It was rare for Deborah to speak of the past, but when she did, people listened. It was 82, explosion at the depot. He walked straight into the flames, carried 3 men out, never said a word, never asked for thanks. He was older even then. "You think it's the same guy?" one private asked, uncertainty replacing his grin. Deborah didn't answer. She didn't need to. The weight in her voice had already said enough. Meanwhile, outside the mess hall, phones were buzzing. The video had made its rounds. But now the commentary was shifting. No more cheap jokes, no more snide remarks. Names were being dropped, stories resurrected. People were starting to ask, who was John Carter? For Deborah, there was no question. "The man you laughed at this morning," she said, her voice low, once walked into hell to pull strangers back out. "You boys might want to remember that before you open your mouths again." There was no anger in her words. Just fact. In the corner, a young staff sergeant was already pulling out his phone. Cross-referencing, verifying. The pieces were falling into place. Outside, the tree under which Carter sat hadn't moved. But the world around him had started to shift. What was once a harmless joke had begun to fracture into something far bigger. The name John Carter was no longer a footnote. It was a question mark hanging over Fort Grantham. People were scrambling to answer. And Deborah Lane, stirring her pot of grits, knew the truth. The name John Carter was starting to echo in the memories of many. Fort Grantham's security office was never quiet. Radios squawked, printers hummed, boots stomped across the linoleum. But when the phone rang that morning, everything stopped. Not the usual desk line, not an internal call. This was a direct line, secured encrypted flashing with a Washington, D.C. prefix. Private Alex Torres saw the caller ID. His breath caught. "Pentagon," he answered. "Fort Grantham Security. Private Torres speaking." The voice on the other end was sharp-clipped, used to being obeyed. "This is Colonel Renee Langston, Special Operations Legacy Office. I need the officer in charge of your main gate. Immediately. Put me on speaker." Torres didn't ask questions. He knew better. With one tap, the room filled with the colonel's voice, calm, but carrying the weight of a missile strike. "Lieutenant Ryan Cooper." "Report." Across the room, Cooper straightened, swagger already faltering. "This is Lieutenant Cooper, ma'am. How can I— You will listen. You will not interrupt." The colonel's words sliced through the air. "I am calling regarding an incident at your checkpoint this morning, involving Sergeant Major John Carter." The temperature in the room dropped. "Ma'am, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. An individual presented an invalid ID and you saw an old man with a faded ID and decided you knew his worth." Langston's tone was ice. "What you failed to recognize is that Sergeant Major Carter's credentials remain active under Directive 117B, indefinitely." A cold wave swept through the office. Even the printers seemed to hold their breath. Langston continued. "You made a spectacle out of a man whose service predates your birth. A man who led Operation Falcon Wing, executing a zero-casualty rescue of 27 POWs in North Vietnam. His record spans 4 branches. His files remain redacted for reasons above your clearance." Cooper's mouth worked, but no words came. "This is not a reprimand, Lieutenant. This is a correction. You've disrespected not just a veteran, but an asset still recognized at the highest levels. Your actions have been noted." Torres watched as Cooper's usual bravado drained away. Around them, other officers had gone rigid, faces pale. Effective immediately, Langston said, "Sergeant Major Carter is to be treated with full honors. You are to stand down, await further instructions, and prepare for official protocol activation." The line clicked off. No pleasantries. No goodbyes. That call wasn't made to apologize. It was made to remind them who they had just spat on. Ryan Cooper's hands trembled slightly. The room was silent, save for the hum of equipment. No one dared speak. Torres felt his phone buzz against his leg. He didn't need to look. He already knew. Messages were spreading through the base like wildfire. The name John Carter was no longer a joke. A corporal near the window stiffened. "Sir, you might want to see this." Outside, a convoy was approaching. Not routine. Black SUVs gleaming under the midday sun. Unmarked, but anyone with half a brain could read the message loud and clear. "Brass. High brass. Gate 4 just went from a checkpoint to ground zero," Torres muttered. Cooper swallowed hard. His earlier confidence now felt absurd. All it had taken was one phone call to dismantle the facade. The joke had ended. The consequences had arrived. Outside, the military convoy closed in on Fort Grantham, and no one was laughing anymore. In the command operations room of Fort Grantham, the air was suffocating. The screens flickered with routine data, vehicle logs, shift rotations, supply reports. But the tension in the room had nothing to do with logistics. Every eye kept darting back to one thing, the direct line that had just gone dead. The Pentagon's voice still echoed in their heads. Captain Mark Sullivan sat at the central desk, the acting grown-up in a room full of suddenly very nervous adults. He wasn't a man easily rattled. 22 years in service, most of it spent untangling bureaucratic disasters. But this wasn't red tape. This was live ammunition. He didn't look up as a junior officer slid a clipboard onto his desk. "Sir, per protocol, we need to log the incident. Carter's entry request is still flagged as invalid credentials, recommending formal denial of access until paperwork's resolved." Sullivan's pen hovered over the line marked "Denial of Access." Unauthorized individual. Standard procedure. Textbook chain of command. The kind of thing that kept the wheels of military bureaucracy turning. He almost signed it. Almost. But his gut hesitated. From the far side of the room, Private Alex Torres stepped forward. He didn't outrank anyone here. He knew his place. But sometimes rank had nothing to do with doing the right thing. "Sir, permission to speak." Sullivan glanced up. His hand still gripped the pen. "Make it quick, Private." Torres didn't flinch. "I believe you should see this first." He placed a tablet on the desk. The screen was paused on a still frame from the now infamous video. John Carter seated under the tree hat in lap cane by his side. Unmoving. The Marine Corps emblem gleamed faintly on the cane's handle. Sullivan frowned. "I'm aware of the video. Not this version, sir. Scroll down." Reluctantly, Sullivan did. The feed wasn't barracks-level chatter anymore. This was pulling from upper-level internal networks, verified comments, official responses. A single post caught his eye. Sergeant Major John Carter, Operation Falcon Wing Commander. Clearance 117B active. His ID is valid. The only thing expired is this base's memory. Underneath, more confirmations. Quiet acknowledgments from people whose names mattered. Silent hands pulling levers Torres couldn't even see. Sullivan's pen wavered. Sir Torres pressed his voice steady. "This isn't a paperwork problem. This is a respect problem. If you sign that denial, you're not following procedure. You're erasing history." Sullivan leaned back. The pen now felt heavier than a sidearm. He had been trained to follow rules, but no rulebook covered this level of stupidity. A denial signature now would not just be a clerical action, it would be a headline. Fort Grantham denies access to decorated war hero. No spin doctor in the Pentagon could clean that up. His jaw tightened. There are moments, Sullivan muttered more to himself than anyone, when one signature can bury a man's honor deeper than any battlefield. The words hung in the air. He set the pen down. Firmly. "Private Torres," he said, meeting the younger man's eyes, "you've got better instincts than half the brass in this building. Consider that noted." Torres nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. "Not yet." Sullivan turned to his adjutant. "Get me a status on Gate 4, now." Before the officer could respond, another voice cut in from across the room. "Sir, visual on approaching convoy. Black government SUVs. ETA 90 seconds. The room shifted. Screens updated. Feet moved faster. Every officer in that room knew what a convoy like that meant. The time for jokes was long past. Sullivan stood adjusting his jacket. "Clear Gate 4's entry logs. Prepare for full honors reception. And someone get Lieutenant Cooper on standby. He'll be explaining himself very soon." No one questioned the order. Torres allowed himself a slow breath. This wasn't fixed, not yet. But the avalanche had been slowed. For now, outside the engines of the incoming convoy growled louder. The moment of reckoning had arrived. At the gates of Fort Grantham, the honor convoy was about to arrive, and no one inside dared to laugh anymore. Fort Grantham's main gate had never looked so clean. In under 5 minutes, every smudge was wiped, every flag repositioned, every uniform straightened. But no amount of polish could scrub away what was coming. The black SUVs rolled in slow and deliberate tires, whispering over the asphalt. The lead vehicle stopped with surgical precision engine idling low, as if daring the base to keep pretending this was a routine day. Colonel Isaac Greer stepped out first. Tall, precise, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice because the world already listened. His dress uniform bore decorations not for show, but for stories people like Cooper hadn't earned the right to hear. He didn't need to announce himself. The air shifted as he crossed the threshold, boots striking the ground with the weight of command. Whereas Sergeant Major Carter Greer's voice was low, but it cut through the assembled personnel like a blade. A corporal pointed toward the tree near the lot. Carter was still there, unmoving, watching. Greer nodded once. Then he turned eyes locking onto the checkpoint. Lieutenant Cooper. The title hit heavier than any insult. Ryan Cooper, who had owned this space just an hour ago now, stood frozen. The smirk was gone. His palms were damp, uniform suddenly too tight. "Step forward." It wasn't a request. Cooper obeyed, legs stiff, throat dry. He was acutely aware of how many eyes tracked his every move. Each step felt louder, heavier. "Stand to attention," Greer ordered. "You will personally render salute to Sergeant Major Carter. Now." Cooper's hand jerked upward, fingers trembling as they reached his brow. His salute was crisp in form, but hollow in spirit, a mimicry of respect he had failed to understand when it mattered. Greer didn't blink. Hold it. Every second dragged. The very place where Carter's idea had been tossed aside now served as the stage for an involuntary confession. Cooper's rigid frame was no longer a symbol of authority. It was a mirror reflecting the arrogance and ignorance of the morning. The joke had come full circle, and no one was laughing. John Carter approached slowly, cane tapping with the same unhurried rhythm. His hat remained in his left hand. His right, free and steady, acknowledged no rush, no need for theatrics. He had been here before, not this gate perhaps, but others like it. As Carter passed Cooper, he didn't slow. He didn't glance sideways. His silence was louder than any reprimand. Greer, however, was not finished. "For your information, Lieutenant," he said, voice razor sharp, "the ID you mocked carries a passive transmitter. It pings once a year, every Veterans Day. That's how we know Sergeant Major Carter is still alive." Cooper's lips parted, but no words came. Greer continued, "We honor him quietly, because he never wanted attention, only to ensure we remembered those who didn't come home. You forgot that today." The words weren't shouted, but their weight pressed down on every uniform in earshot. Cooper's salute faltered. His arm dropped, but the lesson remained suspended in the air. Greer turned to his officers. "Stand down. Prepare for honors protocol." The machine of the base jolted into motion. But beneath the movements, beneath the commands and clicks of heels, one truth lingered. The gate of Fort Grantham had become a mirror that reflected more than just a decorated veteran walking through. It reflected a morning of cheap jokes that would stain careers. It reflected a failure of memory of values of simple decency, and most of all, it reflected how quickly respect, once lost, demanded to be earned back through silence, through action, through shame. John Carter passed through that gate, not as a guest, not as an inconvenience, but as the embodiment of something far older and heavier than any rank Cooper had ever worn. He didn't ask to be seen. But now no one could look away. John Carter stepped forward, and as he passed every head along the line, bowed not by order, but because the weight of their own reflection left them no choice. Fort Grantham's main thoroughfare had never felt this suffocating. A double line of soldiers flanked the road from the gate to the memorial courtyard, uniforms, starched boots locked to the asphalt, but their faces betrayed the truth. They weren't standing at attention out of protocol. They were standing because they had no choice. At the head of the line, Sergeant Kylie Barnes adjusted her posture. Her pulse pounded beneath her collar. This morning she had laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, but enough. Enough to be part of it. Now, every second she stood there, ramrod straight, felt like penance. Private Alex Torres stood midway down the line. His expression was stone, but inside his chest was a furnace. He had sounded the alarm, tried to stop the worst of it, and yet even his earlier silence felt complicit. He knew it. Everyone knew it. The soft tap of a cane echoed down the corridor. John Carter walked slowly, hat in one hand, cane in the other. Each step was deliberate, not from weakness, but from intent. He wasn't parading. He wasn't basking. He was simply moving forward the way men who've carried too much for too long tend to do. But with each strike of his cane, the weight shifted. Not on him, on them. Barnes's throat tightened as Carter approached. She had saluted 1,000 times, in drills, in inspections, reflex, muscle memory. But this was different. She snapped to attention, not because the manual said so, because her conscience demanded it. Across the line, others followed, one by one, a ripple of posture correcting itself. Not forced, not ordered, organic. Shame turned into respect, the only way it ever can through quiet recognition. Carter passed them without acknowledgement. Not out of arrogance, but because this wasn't his victory. It was their reckoning. Torres's salute came next. Crisp, honest, and heavy. He watched Carter draw closer, cane tapping head level. The older man didn't look at him. Didn't need to. Torres felt seen regardless. As the procession continued, the whispers began to fade, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Every soldier in that corridor had heard the story by now. Operation Falcon Wing, the impossible rescue. The lives pulled from darkness by the same hands now gripping that cane. Yet Carter walked as if none of it mattered, and maybe that's why it mattered more. At the rear, near the officers' cluster, Lieutenant Ryan Cooper stood to attention. Rigid, formal, but inside his thoughts churned. The salute he had offered minutes ago had been forced commanded. Now, watching the man walk past with such quiet gravity, he understood the vast gulf between appearance and substance. For the first time, Cooper felt what it was like to be small in the right way, because respect isn't loud. It isn't about rank. It's about recognizing the weight someone else has carried without ever asking you to notice. John Carter's passage down that corridor was not a march of triumph. It was a mirror. Every salute returned was less about him, more about the one giving it, about reclaiming a fragment of self-respect lost that morning. As he neared the courtyard, the silence thickened. It wasn't awkward. It was earned. The final stretch of the corridor opened ahead. John Carter's cane tapped once more, and as it did, Fort Grantham stood a little straighter. John Carter walked on toward the memorial wall, leaving behind a corridor of bowed heads, not by command, but by conscience. The memorial wall stood like a quiet sentinel at the heart of Fort Grantham. No fanfare, no flags flapping, just names. Names carved so deep into the stone that time itself seemed afraid to erase them. John Carter stood before it now. The weight of the day had not bent his shoulders. He had walked this far not for applause, not for forgiveness, but for this. Slowly from inside his jacket he retrieved a plain envelope, worn at the edges. The ink on its face was simple, unfussy. To myself, when they forget. He hadn't expected an audience. This letter had been written in the quiet spaces of nights most people slept through, not for publication, not for spectacle, just for a man preparing himself for the inevitable erasure of history. He knelt not out of weakness, but out of reverence. His fingers traced the names on the wall, each one as familiar as his own reflection. These were not just fellow Marines. They were the men whose laughter he remembered more vividly than any battlefield. "I wrote this," he said, not turning to the silent crowd behind him, "for the day they stopped asking who you were. For the day when your names would be stone, not stories." The envelope, yellowed by time, was placed gently at the base of the wall. I thought today might be that day. His voice was steady, unapologetic, but the courtyard was holding its breath. He stood again, slower now, but not because of age, because some gestures deserved their own pace. Colonel Isaac Greer took 2 steps forward. His voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. "You were wrong, Sergeant Major." Carter turned, his brow furrowed slightly. "We've been retrieving your letters. Every year," Greer continued. "You left them here thinking no one noticed. But we did. Quietly, respectfully, and we delivered them." The words hit like a slow, deliberate strike. To the families, Carter asked, not masking his surprise. Greer nodded. "Every single one. Some of them read your letters out loud at dinner. Some framed them, some just hold them. The way you've been holding this place." The silence deepened. Carter's composure, unshaken through mockery, through dismissal, through staged apologies, finally wavered. His breath caught, but his posture held. I didn't write them expecting anyone to read, he admitted. Maybe that's why they mattered more, Greer replied. Among the gathered ranks, Private Alex Torres felt the burn behind his eyes. He had seen duty before. He had understood honor as a concept. But this was different. This was tangible, heavy, real. At the back of the courtyard, Lieutenant Ryan Cooper stood rigid, his earlier arrogance now hollow. Watching Carter face the wall, watching the ripple of realization sweep through the base, he understood for the first time that respect wasn't given with rank. It was given with time, with stories, with truth. Carter looked back to the names. They followed orders that should never have been given, he said. But they followed me. That's something you carry, whether they remember you or not. Greer said nothing. He didn't need to. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the courtyard. And then Carter did something no one expected. He smiled. Not wide. Not for show. But with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose worst fear that they would forget had been proven wrong. He tapped the cane once, a punctuation mark on decades of silent service. I came prepared to be forgotten today, he said. Turns out you were paying attention after all. There was no applause, no cheers. But the stillness itself was louder than any ceremony. Behind Carter, the soldiers stood straighter, not by command, by choice. As he turned to leave, his cane striking rhythmically against the stone, the letter remained at the base of the wall, small, unassuming, but no longer unnoticed, because today Fort Grantham remembered, and now they would not forget again. The ripple of what Carter had done, the lives he had honored in secret, was no longer buried beneath bureaucratic indifference. It was alive, it was present, and it was theirs to carry forward. The letter may have been addressed to himself, but its message had always belonged to them. The crowd did not move until Carter had passed through. Those letters Sergeant Major Carter left year after year had never gathered dust. Fort Grantham had been delivering them all along quietly, reverently, turning his solitary act of remembrance into a tradition of their own. The memorial wall loomed quietly behind them, but for Ryan Cooper, it might as well have been a mirror. Every step he took toward John Carter felt heavier than boots in the mud. This wasn't a march of rank. It was a walk of reckoning. Carter had finished his quiet ritual. The envelope lay at the base of the wall, simple yet monumental. The courtyard had settled into a reverent hush, but the weight of unfinished business still hung in the air. Ryan stopped a few feet away. For a man who had once swaggered through this very gate with mockery on his lips, even standing this close now felt monumental. "Sergeant Major," he began, his voice steadier than he expected. "I owe you an apology." Carter didn't turn immediately. His hand remained on the wall, fingers resting lightly against the names. When he did face Cooper, his expression was unreadable. "I'm not here to make excuses," Ryan continued. "What I said this morning wasn't just disrespectful. It was ignorant. I saw an old man and assumed there was nothing behind that." The words didn't come easy. But for once, Ryan wasn't performing. This wasn't for show. This was the first honest salute he had ever given, even if it came in the form of an apology. Behind them, Alex Torres stood quietly, arms crossed, not as a skeptic, but as silent support. He had seen the worst of Cooper this morning. But watching him now, there was no schadenfreude. Only the cautious hope that people could, in fact, learn. "You didn't owe me respect," Lieutenant Carter said evenly. "You owed it to the men whose names you didn't bother to know. Today wasn't about me." Ryan nodded slowly. "I know that now, and I know sorry isn't enough. But I needed to say it anyway. Not because it changes the past, but because it should change me." The air between them was thick, but not hostile. Carter studied him for a moment longer, then said, "Dignity isn't in never failing. It's in how you stand back up after you've knelt in your own mistakes." For a moment, Ryan felt something shift. Not a pardon, not absolution, but permission to carry the lesson forward. "I won't forget this, Sergeant Major," Ryan said. His words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. Carter nodded once. Then, as if dismissing the formalities, he reached out not for a handshake, but for a simple pat on the shoulder. Firm. Steady. Human. "You've got time, Lieutenant. Don't waste it." The gesture was small, but it felt like 1,000-pound weight lifting. From his position, Torres allowed himself a faint smile. He had watched Cooper stumble through this morning with all the grace of a man falling on his own ego. But this was different. This was the beginning of something better. As Cooper stepped back, his gaze shifted not just to Carter, but to the wall, to the names. For the first time, he read them not as engravings, but as echoes of stories he had yet to earn the right to tell. The lesson was simple. Dignity wasn't inherited. It was built. Brick by quiet brick. As the courtyard breathed again, Carter returned his attention to the envelope at the wall's base. But this time he wasn't alone in that reflection. Ryan Cooper stood beside him, not out of obligation but out of choice. Torres joined them, flanking the opposite side. No words exchanged, no orders given. Just 3 men separated by decades, connected by the quiet understanding that respect once lost demands to be rebuilt by those willing to bear its weight. The wind shifted, catching the edge of the envelope, but it didn't move. It stayed rooted like the lesson it carried. Fort Grantham had seen ceremonies before, but today it had witnessed a man grow. And sometimes that was the bravest thing of all, because courage isn't just charging into enemy fire. Sometimes it's standing still, facing your own reflection and saying "I was wrong." As the crowd observed in silence, no one needed to be told what had just happened. This wasn't redemption. This was responsibility, and Ryan Cooper had taken his first step toward earning the uniform he wore. Fort Grantham had learned many lessons today, but this one needed a symbol, something more permanent than a viral video or a whispered story. It was time to carve this memory into stone. 2 weeks after that, Veterans Day morning, Fort Grantham stood different. Not in structure, in memory. What had once been a gate of routine now hummed with something heavier, something earned. The base commander had not hesitated. No panels, no debates. The decision was unanimous. The main gate would bear a new name, the John Carter Gate, for the quiet valor we almost forgot. The bronze plaque gleamed beneath the noon sun, freshly mounted yet already timeless. The letters were bold, but the message was humble, just like the man it honored. No speeches marked its installation, no trumpets. Instead, they chose what Carter himself had lived by action, not noise. Deborah Lane stood near the edge of the small crowd. Arms crossed, apron still dusted with flour from the morning's baking. She hadn't come for ceremony. She came because she knew how easy it was to forget men like Carter. Men who didn't ask to be remembered. Men who simply did what had to be done. She let out a slow breath. The last time she'd seen Carter this close was back in '82, when smoke had choked the sky, and most people had been running the other way. He hadn't said a word then either. Some things never change. Nearby, Alex Torres watched as the final bolts secured the plaque. He remembered the video, the laughter, the sickening twist in his gut as it had all unraveled. But today there was no bitterness in him, because today they had chosen to remember the right way. A few feet from Torres, Lieutenant Ryan Cooper stood silent. Not center stage. Not because he was hiding, but because this wasn't his moment. His role had been played. His lesson had been learned. Now it was about keeping that lesson alive. The plaque was more than an apology. It was a warning, a marker for every recruit who passed through that gate from this day forward. A reminder that valor wasn't loud, that respect wasn't automatic, that forgetting had a cost. The base commander stepped forward, not with a speech, but with a simple gesture. He ran his hand across the plaque, fingers brushing the etched words as if sealing a promise. Deborah Lane approached next. She didn't touch the plaque. She didn't need to. Instead, she straightened the small arrangement of flowers placed at its base. Quiet, simple, fitting. "This isn't for him," she said softly, mostly to herself. "This is for the ones coming after, so they don't make the same mistake." Torres heard her, and he understood. In the days since he had read through Carter's old letters, the base had made copies, personal handwritten accounts of bravery not his own, but of the men whose names lined that memorial wall. Torres had found himself reading them slowly, letting each word settle. They weren't grand stories, no embellishments, just facts, and somehow that made them hit harder. The plaque shimmered as sunlight struck its face. The same gate that had once turned Carter away in humiliation now stood as his guardian, a symbol forged not from ceremony but from correction. It was perfect. As the small crowd began to disperse, Torres remained. One last look, one last reminder. He could already picture it. New recruits arriving, boots, crisp minds, eager passing beneath that plaque. Some might glance at it, others might read it fully, but every single one of them would walk through knowing there was a story behind it, a story about failure, about respect, about remembering. Torres allowed himself a small, quiet smile. They had almost missed it, almost let a living legacy slip through their fingers. Almost, but not this time. The gate would make sure of that. The plaque wouldn't shout. It would wait, just like Carter had, a constant, silent teacher. And every time someone passed through, they'd be reminded valor isn't in medals or speeches. It's in the quiet choices that never make headlines but build the very foundation of honor. Carter hadn't needed a monument, but Fort Grantham had needed this one. Not for him, for themselves, for the ones yet to come. The plaque stood firm. The gate bore its new name, and the lesson had been carved into more than just metal. But Fort Grantham's journey to honor John Carter wasn't over yet. Fort Grantham's mess hall had never been known for quiet. It was where boots clattered against tile, where voices rose over trays of reheated meals, where laughter, sometimes crude, sometimes nervous, echoed between steel counters and plastic chairs. But tonight there was no laughter. Tonight the noise had given way to something heavier. Respect. The long tables were lined not with silverware, but with stories. Printed sheets of paper, each carrying the words of John Carter's letters, sat folded at every place setting. No ceremony, no official statement, just a simple instruction at the top. Read before you eat. Deborah Lane stood at the serving line, arms crossed, apron dusted with flour. She hadn't asked for a special menu tonight. Carter wouldn't have wanted fanfare. But the rolls were fresh. The stew was made from scratch. If you're going to feed respect, you do it right. Private Alex Torres moved between the tables, helping distribute the last few sheets. He noticed the shift in posture. Shoulders that had slumped in casual routine now squared up. Conversations dropped to whispers, then faded altogether as soldiers began to read. The mess hall, for the first time in Torres's memory, felt sacred. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper sat near the end of the first table. The paper in his hands trembled slightly, not from nerves but from weight. This wasn't the sanitized history they were used to. Carter's words were raw, direct. There was no glorification, no soft edges. They didn't die in a blaze of glory. They bled out in mud and silence, sometimes asking if we'd remember them. I promised I would. I didn't promise I'd be listened to. Cooper's throat tightened. Across from him, a young private barely 19 folded his paper back into a perfect square, then straightened his back. That simple movement, that quiet correction, said more than any standing ovation. At the far end, Deborah Lane caught Torres's eye. She didn't need to speak. The message was clear. This was how you teach legacy. Not with speeches, with truth. One table at a time. As the soldiers read, the atmosphere thickened not with guilt, but with understanding. For many, it was the first time they saw the difference between being in uniform and embodying it. Greer entered quietly, bypassing the usual command fanfare. He took a place at the end, no rank on display. Just another man holding Carter's words in his hands. The mess hall's clock ticked louder than the voices had earlier in the day. Torres sat down, unfolding his own letter. Even though he had read it before aloud during the planning, it felt different now. Surrounded by others, by silence, by shared realization, every word carried more weight. Valor isn't loud. It's the man who stands back up when the world stops watching. Simple. Unadorned. And yet in that mess hall filled with men and women trained for battle, those words struck deeper than any weapon. Dinner was served, but no one rushed. Every bite felt deliberate. Every glance toward the letters a quiet acknowledgement that the uniform was not a shield against ignorance, but a constant challenge to rise above it. Cooper pushed his tray aside. His appetite had been replaced with something far more demanding. Responsibility. He stood. Not loudly, not dramatically, just stood. The room noticed, but no one spoke. He walked the length of the hall, stopping in front of Torres. "You were right," he said, low but firm. "That morning you saw it before the rest of us did. I should have listened." Torres didn't smile. He nodded. "Seeing it is easy. Doing something about it is the hard part." Cooper's jaw tightened. "Then let's make sure we don't forget again." A ripple of attention spread through the hall. Not applause, not cheers, just a collective shift, a recognition that leadership wasn't about volume. It was about action. Greer watched from his seat, nodding slowly. The point had landed. Torres picked up his letter once more. "I think," he said louder now, "we should make this dinner a tradition. Every year, Veterans Day, one letter, one story, read before we eat." No formal vote was needed. It was decided in the silence. Deborah Lane wiped her hands on her apron. "That's how you feed respect," she murmured. As the evening wore on, conversation returned, not with jokes, but with stories. Veterans shared memories they had never voiced in this room. Young soldiers listened more than they spoke. Carter wasn't there in body, but his presence filled every inch of the mess hall. Outside, the plaque at the gate gleamed under the base lights. Inside, legacy was no longer a history lesson. It was living. Breathed in. Understood. For Cooper, it was the first meal he'd had in months that tasted like responsibility. For Torres, it was the quiet confirmation that small acts, asking the right question, making the quiet call, could ripple further than he'd imagined. As the last trays were cleared, the hall remained full. Not of noise, of purpose, because sometimes a letter written for yourself becomes the guide for those who follow. And tonight Fort Grantham had followed well, but honoring Carter wasn't just about reflection. There was still a story left to finish. The base had one more promise to keep. 1 year later, the sun rose over Fort Grantham with the same quiet dignity it always had. The routine was unchanged. Boots hit the ground, morning drills echoed across the yards, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. It was Veterans Day again, but this time no memos were sent, no orders issued, and yet before the clock struck 8, soldiers lined the main corridor from the John Carter Gate to the memorial wall. Uniforms, crisp boots gleaming, not because they had been told to, but because now they knew better. There was no command for respect. Respect had become instinct. Private Alex Torres stood near the front of the line. This time his arms weren't crossed defensively. They hung at his sides, ready steady. He watched as the newest recruits filed into place, some barely out of basic, their faces, a mix of nerves and something deeper pride, not in themselves, but in the legacy they now upheld. The gate opened. No convoy, no motorcade, just a simple military SUV, unremarkable, save for the weight of what it represented. John Carter stepped out, cane in hand, hat in place. Age had not slowed him further, but the years sat on his shoulders in ways no visible wound could show. Yet his posture remained straight. Not out of defiance, out of habit, a habit forged in foxholes and fire. As he approached, there was no need for announcement. One by one, hands snapped to salutes. No shouted commands, no synchronized drills, just a ripple of reverence moving down the corridor like a silent wave. Carter walked slowly, deliberately, his cane tapping the rhythm of decades past. He didn't smile, he didn't wave, but his eyes, sharp beneath the brim of his hat, acknowledged every face, every gesture. At the center of the formation, Torres felt his throat tighten. This wasn't the spectacle of last year. There were no journalists, no viral videos, just soldiers remembering because they had chosen to. Further down, Lieutenant Ryan Cooper stood among his peers. His salute was crisp, but this time it was different. Last year it had been redemption. Today it was respect. Earned. Lived, carried forward. As Carter passed, Cooper's eyes remained forward, but his thoughts were loud. He remembered how easily they had failed before, how quickly assumptions had blinded them. Not today. Today, Fort Grantham remembered for the right reasons. At the memorial wall, the familiar envelope awaited its place. Deborah Lane had left it there that morning, as she did now, without being asked. The note was new, but the ritual was the same. Carter approached the wall. No speeches, no preamble. His hand, steady as ever, placed the envelope at the base. His fingers lingered on the stone tracing names that only he seemed to still carry aloud. Behind him, no one moved. No phones, no whispers, only the soft rustle of the morning breeze, as if even nature itself knew when to be still. After a long moment, Carter straightened. The salute he returned was slow, deliberate, and though age had crept into his bones, the gesture carried the weight of men who had never come home. As he turned, the corridor remained rigid, but the air was charged with something more than formality. It was pride. Not in themselves. In him. But Carter's gaze didn't linger on the saluting soldiers. Instead, he sought out the youngest among them, the faces that would one day carry this torch further. And that was the point. Tradition isn't what is commanded, it's what survives without being told. As he passed through the lines once more, there was no need for words. The soldiers understood that this was not a performance. This was a privilege. From her vantage point, Deborah Lane watched with quiet satisfaction. She remembered when laughter had filled this corridor for the wrong reasons. Today the silence was deafening in the best possible way. When Carter reached the end of the formation, the base commander approached. There was no grand speech prepared, only a simple phrase. "Welcome home, Sergeant Major." Carter nodded once. For a man who had never demanded recognition, who had spent years assuming his letters would yellow in obscurity, this moment was enough. More than enough. As the ranks were dismissed, no one rushed away. Conversation stayed low, respectful. Recruits asked quiet questions. Veterans offered quiet answers. The weight of legacy had found its rightful place not on the walls, but in the people. Torres remained near the gate long after most had moved on. He watched Carter speak briefly with Greer, with Barnes with Cooper. Not as subordinates, as equals in understanding. "You think he knows?" Cooper asked, stepping up beside Torres. "Knows what?" Torres replied. "That this, all of this, is because of him." Torres considered that. "I think he hoped it would happen. But I don't think he ever needed it to." Cooper nodded slowly. "And that's exactly why he deserves it." They stood in silence, watching as Carter made his slow way back toward the gate. The plaque gleamed beneath the midday sun. The John Carter Gate, for the quiet valor we almost forgot. But they hadn't forgotten. Not anymore. Carter paused once before exiting his hand, briefly touching the plaque, not for himself, but for the names still carved into his memory. The moment passed. He departed quietly, just as he had always done, The soldiers returned to their duties, but their posture remained different, a little straighter, a little more aware, because true respect isn't something you perform once a year. It's something you live every day. And at Fort Grantham, that lesson no longer needed a memo. It was tradition now, a living one. But even traditions have their final chapters. And soon Fort Grantham would face the hardest part of honoring a legacy letting go. The small office at the back of John Carter's modest home was nothing remarkable. A wooden desk scuffed by years of use, a single chair, shelves lined with old manuals, faded photos, and yellowed folders. The only window faced east, letting in the morning light soft and unassuming. It was here, amid the dust and quiet, that they found it. An envelope. Plain, unadorned, addressed not to a family member, not to an official, to Fort Grantham. Inside, a letter. To those who still wear the uniform, by the time you read this, I'll have joined the names carved in stone. I won't pretend to have been more than I was. A soldier, a leader, and sometimes a stubborn old man who couldn't let go. But this isn't about me. This is about you, about the weight you carry now. Because honor doesn't expire. It doesn't fade with the paper of old IDs. It lives in how you treat the ones who came before, the ones beside you, and the ones who will come after. If you forget that the uniform becomes a costume, if you remember it becomes a legacy. The words were simple. Unpolished. But for Private First Class Alex Torres, standing before a full graduation class at Fort Grantham, they held more weight than any medal pinned that day. He looked out at the sea of fresh faces. Eager. Nervous. Unaware that today wasn't just their beginning, it was a continuation of something much older. In his final letter, Torres continued aloud, John Carter didn't ask for parades. He didn't demand statues. He asked for one thing that we remember. The auditorium was silent. No orders had been given for that silence. It had simply happened. Because somewhere between Carter's words and the weight in Torres's voice, the lesson had landed. Every name on that wall was once a man who stood where you stand now, full of pride, full of purpose. Some were seen, some were forgotten. I wrote their names so they wouldn't vanish in the cracks of time. Today you carry that torch. Don't let it dim. Torres folded the letter carefully. This was found on his desk the morning after he passed. No ceremony, no fanfare, just his words waiting. He stepped back, letting the letter's weight settle. Among the graduates there were no murmurs, no restless shifting. Even the youngest among them understood that this moment wasn't about rank, it was about respect. As the ceremony concluded, no one needed to be told what came next. The march to the memorial wall happened without cue. Every cadet filed out in quiet formation, not from obligation, but from recognition. Carter's final letter had done what no lecture could. It had reached them. Because honor never asks for permission. It simply expects to be remembered. From that day forward, John Carter's story wasn't just told. It was lived. Fort Grantham had found its living lesson. The first day of basic training at Fort Grantham was always a storm of chaos. Boots slammed against concrete. Drill sergeants barked with gleeful brutality. Recruits scrambled half in terror, half in adrenaline-fueled excitement. But before the shouting began, before the first push-up hit the dirt, the new recruits found themselves standing before the memorial wall. It wasn't in the handbook, but it was now tradition. The John Carter gate gleamed behind them, the morning light catching the bronze inscription. Fresh recruits stood in uneven lines, shifting awkwardly, not yet molded into the sharp edges of military formality. An instructor stepped forward. Not a high-ranking officer, just a sergeant with lines on his face and a voice that didn't need to be raised to command attention. Before you learn how to stand in formation, you'll learn why. He gestured toward the wall. You'll hear a lot of stories here. Some about glory, some about sacrifice. But there's one you'll hear first. And that's about a man named John Carter. The recruits listened, unsure if this was a test. It was, but not the kind they were expecting. John Carter wasn't the loudest man. He didn't lead with noise. He led with action. He carried men out of fire. He wrote letters to families long after the world stopped asking. And for a long time we failed to see him. The sergeant's gaze swept the line. Until one day when we nearly forgot what we stand for. He didn't need to spell it out. The plaque behind them did that for him. John Carter Gate, for the quiet valor we almost forgot. The recruits were told the story, not with fanfare, with honesty. How a simple ID card once laughed at had carried more history than half the base's archives. How respect once lost had been reclaimed not with orders, but with choice. Remember this, the sergeant said. No medal makes you worthy of this uniform. Your actions do. Your integrity does. Carter never asked for your salute. But you'll give it. Because respect isn't about rank. It's about who you are when no one's watching. The recruits straightened. Not perfectly, but earnestly. And that was enough. Because Carter's legacy wasn't built on perfection. It was built on persistence. From the windows of the administrative building, Alex Torres watched the scene unfold. He smiled not broadly, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew they had gotten it right. Beside him, Lieutenant Ryan Cooper nodded. "This isn't in the curriculum," Cooper said. "No," Torres replied. "But it's in the blood now." Down by the wall, the recruits raised their first salute. Not synchronized, not pretty. But real. That was all Carter would have wanted. As the day's training roared to life, the story of John Carter remained behind their eyes, in every shouted command, in every boot hitting the ground. Because Fort Grantham hadn't changed to honor John Carter, because he demanded it. They had changed because for the first time they had truly seen him, and once you see a man like that, you can't go back to pretending you don't. The legacy had taken root, not as a chapter in a manual, but as a standard, silent, steady, enduring. Fort Grantham stood as it always had, but now it stood taller, because a man who never asked for attention had become the reason they finally paid it. At Fort Grantham, no banners were raised for John Carter. No parades marked his passing. And yet, without ever demanding it, he became the standard by which every soldier measures themselves. Not because of medals, but because of moments, quiet, unnoticed moments, where integrity stood taller than rank. His story isn't about grand victories. It's about the quiet courage to remember to act and to hold fast to dignity, even when the world looks away. Today, new recruits at Fort Grantham don't learn about John Carter from textbooks. They learn his story before they ever lace their boots. Because honor once almost forgotten has become their first lesson. And perhaps that is the most fitting tribute. Now we'd like to hear from you. What does quiet valor mean to you? Have you ever known someone like John Carter? Someone who led not with words, but with quiet example. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who values integrity, and subscribe to our channel for more real stories that remind us what respect truly looks like. Because some legacies don't need to ask for attention. They earn it.